Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping back into the medieval world, not to admire chivalry or pageantry, but to uncover something quieter and more revealing. While medieval weddings are often painted as romantic unions beneath soaring arches, they were just as often cold calculations designed to transfer land, forge alliances, and secure power. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly find these hidden histories as compelling as I do. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what hour it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and let's begin this journey together. The bride traded for an orchard and a flock of sheep. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a modest medieval orchard, the low afternoon sun painting the leaves in warm gold. The air is thick with the scent of ripening pears and the faint musk of livestock drifting from the paddocks beyond. For the families who lived here, this orchard was not simply a collection of trees. It was a sign of standing, a carefully tended inheritance, and a store of wealth more reliable than coin. In the countryside, land and animals often spoke louder than any chest of silver. This was the context in which a nobleman, hoping to ease decades of quiet enmity with a rival clan, arranged the marriage of his only daughter. Her dowry was not jewels or elaborate fabrics. Instead, it was this orchard you are picturing now, and a flock of sheep with fleece prized for both warmth and trade. To understand why such a transaction could reshape alliances, you must consider the rhythm of daily life in medieval rural communities. Currency was unstable, often diluted or counterfeited, but a grove that yielded fruit year after year, and sheep that multiplied and fed many, offered a dependable measure of prosperity. The bride herself was, in the eyes of her father and the village, a link between households, a living guarantee that the orchard and the flock would now belong to her husband's kin. In many ways, this was thought to be a gentler form of peacemaking. No blades drawn, no fires set in the night, only an exchange of oaths and resources, stitched together by a ceremony in a small stone church. Imagine the preparations in the weeks before the wedding. The orchard workers, accustomed to their quiet labors, now worked under a hush of anticipation. They laid out woven baskets lined with straw, ensuring each piece of fruit picked as part of the dowry would appear unblemished. The shepherds combed through the flock, selecting the healthiest ewes, their wool dense and clean. There were no great parades or the lavish pageantry that characterized the unions of highborn lords. Instead, the gestures were measured, almost subdued, but no less significant. Each sheep carried the promise of future abundance, just as each tree offered the continuity of nourishment and commerce. On the day of the marriage, neighbors gathered along the narrow road leading to the church. The bride's family walked in front of the small procession of animals, their steps deliberate. Some carried tokens of bread and salt to symbolize hospitality and lasting accord. You might picture the bride herself in a gown of undyed wool, her hair bound simply, a sprig of rosemary tucked behind her ear to signal remembrance. There was a quiet gravity to the way she walked, understanding that she was not merely leaving her childhood home, but also embodying her father's ambitions for stability. It was believed that a well-negotiated marriage could heal old grievances better than any treaty signed under duress. This bride's story was not unique. In countless small villages across Europe, daughters were pledged in marriage as part of practical arrangements to consolidate land, pacify rivals, or repay debts. These unions were sometimes marked by genuine affection that developed over time, and sometimes by polite resignation to a life chosen by others. Over the months that followed, the orchard became a symbol of reconciliation. The rival clan's children were allowed to play beneath its branches. At harvest, both households worked side by side, their hands brushing as they reached for the same fruit. The flock, meanwhile, multiplied steadily in the pastures beyond the churchyard walls. Its wool was sold at the market, funding improvements to cottages and repairs to the village mill. Consider the sensory tapestry of this new life. The hush of dawn when shepherds drove the sheep to fresh grazing, the sweet tang of crushed pears beneath boot soles, the damp chill of stone floors in the manor house that the bride now called her own. Such details anchor her to this place, even as she quietly recalled the familiar orchard rows of her girlhood. In the evenings, she might stand at the threshold, listening to the soft calls of ewes settling in for the night, feeling the weight of her role as both a peace offering and a matron of a new household. It is easy from a modern vantage to imagine such a marriage as simply transactional, a negotiation stripped of sentiment. But for those who lived it, the boundaries between duty and hope were often blurred. A bride brought not just property, but a web of expectations and the chance, however fragile, that kindness could grow between strangers. In a time when family conflicts could span generations, these unions represented a quiet optimism. If two households could share in the tending of orchards and the care of sheep, perhaps old bitterness could soften. Over time, as the first winters passed, the orchard flourished under its new stewardship. Pruners trimmed branches in careful rhythms handed down through the generations. The sheep's wool grew thick and lustrous, a testament to careful breeding and steady pasture. The bride bore children who would inherit both the land and the unspoken agreement that peace had been bought with living things rather than blood. In this way, the orchard and the flock did what no sword could ever accomplish. They transformed enemies into reluctant allies, then perhaps something gentler. Imagine, finally, a decade later, the same trees casting longer shadows, the flock grown so numerous that part of it had to be sold to a distant cousin. The bride, now a woman marked by sun and time, walks slowly between the rows of trees, feeling the rough bark beneath her palms. She has come to understand that her dowry was never simply about property. It was about finding a way to mend what had been broken for too long. In the quiet of the orchard, beneath the low calls of sheep in the distance, she can almost believe that the past has been laid to rest. And so, in a landscape shaped by old grudges and the constant struggle for survival, a marriage like this was more than a footnote. It was a small triumph of patience and careful calculation. A reminder that in the medieval world, true currency was measured in roots sunk deep in the earth and the slow, steady growth of trust. The wedding that changed a border without war. Imagine yourself standing on the gentle slope of a valley, where the air carries the faint scent of pine and freshly turned soil. The quiet murmur of a distant stream threads through the landscape, weaving a subtle soundtrack beneath the vast, open sky. This valley, seemingly untouched and serene, was once the subject of a quiet but powerful negotiation. A negotiation sealed not with weapons or battle cries, but with a marriage contract. The wedding that changed a border without war is a story of diplomacy, tradition, and the rhythm of feudal life, unfolding in a time when alliances were often forged by the joining of families rather than the clash of armies. In medieval Europe, borders were not the neat lines we see on modern maps. Instead, they were often fluid, shaped by geography, marriage, inheritance, and the shifting tides of power. Lords and nobles controlled lands through complex webs of family ties and obligations, where the fate of a valley could hinge on the subtle movements of a marriage contract. Imagine yourself as one of the many who lived within these domains, where the rising sun illuminated not only fields and forests, but also the fragile balance of power that defined everyday existence. The valley in question was a patchwork of hills and streams, dotted with small villages whose inhabitants toiled the land and tended livestock. The rhythm of their lives was intertwined with the seasons and the authority of the local lord. Ownership meant more than property. It meant protection, justice, and the right to collect rents and tithes. Control over such a region was vital for maintaining influence and securing resources. Yet, this particular valley had long been disputed between two feudal lords, each claiming it through ancestral rights and political maneuvering. The tension simmered quietly, threatening to erupt into open conflict. Instead, a solution was found in an ancient and delicate tradition: marriage. The proposed union involved a bride and groom who, by the design of their elders, would never meet before the ceremony. Their families arranged this marriage with a precise intention: to redefine the border by uniting their claims through kinship. Imagine the quiet deliberations in stone halls, where parchment scrolls outlined the terms of the contract, where advisors whispered counsel and weighed the merits of peace over war. The bride, a young woman of noble birth, was bound to leave her childhood home and enter a new world. A new domain she would govern by association, not by familiarity. The groom, equally removed from the personal intimacy of the match, would gain a legal claim to the valley, his family's banner poised to flutter over lands that once belonged to a rival. This marriage was less about affection and more about strategy, an emblem of the political realities that shaped medieval existence. On the day of the wedding, the ceremony was marked by rituals both solemn and symbolic. Imagine the echo of soft chants in the chapel, the scent of burning incense mingling with that of polished wood and heavy velvet. The bride entered clad in a gown spun from fine wool and embroidered with subtle motifs, signs of her family's heraldry and the hopes tied to this union. The groom waited, his presence distant but dignified, embodying the weight of his family's expectations. Though the two had never met, their joining was witnessed by lords, clergy, and common folk alike, a collective recognition of the shift about to take place. As the final vows were spoken, the valley's fate was sealed without a single sword drawn. The border that once divided was redrawn on a map, not of conquest, but of kinship. The union was recorded in meticulous detail by scribes whose hands preserved this moment for generations. For the villagers living beneath the hills, this change brought new lordship and new obligations, but also a measure of peace where uncertainty had lingered. The implications of such a wedding rippled beyond the immediate geography. Feudal society depended heavily on these alliances, where marriages served as tools of diplomacy and instruments of stability. Imagine the countless other valleys, castles, and courts where similar unions shaped the political landscape, weaving a tapestry of connections that held kingdoms together or pulled them apart. Each contract was a silent accord, a delicate thread in the vast fabric of medieval power. Moreover, this practice reflected the complex relationship between personal lives and public duty. The bride and groom, while central figures in this grand design, often remained distant from the emotional bonds we associate with marriage today. Their lives were subject to the decisions of family elders, the demands of lineage, and the pressing need for political expediency. Imagine the young bride, perhaps gazing from her new window at the unfamiliar valley below, aware that her presence there was both a blessing and a burden, a living symbol of peace, yet also a reminder of the sacrifices made for it. Yet, despite the lack of personal connection, these marriages had lasting social and economic effects. The consolidation of territories brought relative stability, which allowed agriculture to flourish and markets to grow. Lords who secured their borders through such contracts could invest in infrastructure, support religious institutions, and maintain the delicate order that governed daily life. For the common people, peace meant fewer raids, steadier rents, and a more predictable harvest cycle, a rhythm less interrupted by the chaos of war. As time passed, the legacy of this wedding endured in local customs, in the shifting patterns of land ownership, and in the oral histories passed down through generations. Imagine the valley's streams continuing to flow, the woods whispering the stories of the past, and the villages maintaining the steady cadence of life. Each breath, each season a quiet testament to a union that changed borders without bloodshed. In reflecting on this story, one can appreciate the subtle power of diplomacy and tradition. The marriage that redrew a border reminds us that history is not solely shaped by grand battles or dramatic upheavals. Sometimes, it is the gentle folding of families, the silent signatures on parchment, and the rituals performed in quiet chapels that steer the course of nations. Imagine yourself walking once more through that valley, feeling the soft earth beneath your feet and sensing the deep currents of history flowing beneath the tranquil surface. This tale encourages a reconsideration of what power means. Sometimes it is wielded in swords and armies, but often it rests in the bonds we form, the promises we keep, and the unseen agreements that shape the world around us. The rhythm of medieval life was, after all, a constant struggle to balance force with finesse, tradition with change, and division with unity. In this delicate dance, a wedding became more than a ceremony. It became a quiet instrument of peace that reshaped the very borders of power. So, as you settle into the calm of the evening, perhaps you can carry with you this story of a marriage that changed a border without war. A reminder that history's most profound changes sometimes come wrapped in the soft folds of a gown and sealed with the gentle clasp of hands. The girl who married a river and became a legend. Imagine yourself standing on the mossy bank of a river that never seems to stop moving. Even in the gentlest season, the water slips past with a soft murmur, swirling around rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. It's difficult to picture that this river, which seems so peaceful under dawn's pale light, was once the center of a decision that would blend folklore, law, and a family's quiet desperation into a single ceremony. Today, you and I are going to drift back to a time when a young woman's destiny was bound not to a husband of flesh and blood, but to the restless current itself. This is the story of the girl who married a river. Though the details of her name and her face have been blurred by time and retelling, the outline remains remarkably consistent across local chronicles and whispered recollections. Her family owned a modest estate, fields of rye that shivered in the wind, a small orchard planted by ancestors, and pastures that relied upon the river's seasonal generosity. But the river had a temperament that no mortal could fully predict. In one summer, it pulled back into its channel, as if granting the villagers a reprieve. The next year, it rose overnight, swallowing pasture and boundary markers alike. When the waters receded, the land was no longer simply theirs. The legal agreements that defined who controlled the riverbank had been submerged and made ambiguous. In medieval law, the memory of property was often as important as the written record. What your neighbors believed could sometimes matter more than what a parchment claimed. And so, the family found themselves in quiet dispute with nearby lords who claimed that, since the river had shifted, the rights to draw water and graze animals had shifted too. It was here, in this tension between survival and the slow grind of legal custom, that the idea of a symbolic marriage emerged. To you, in a modern world of contracts and surveying equipment, it may seem quaint or even absurd. But imagine a world where ceremony held the force of law, where gestures and rites could anchor an uncertain claim. By offering their daughter in ritual marriage to the river itself, her family could declare that their bond with the water was unbroken and irrevocable. The preparations were simple, but every movement carried a gravity that outlasted the moment. She dressed in linen dyed with the faintest wash of blue, an echo of the river's own color when the sky was clear. Around her neck, she wore a strand of freshwater pearls, each one gathered by hand from the shallows. These were not jewels of great worth, but they held a certain quiet symbolism, a lifetime of dependence on what the river yielded. At dawn, accompanied by her father and 2 witnesses from the neighboring manor, she walked the worn footpath to a bend in the river where an alder tree leaned over the bank. The ground was thick with the scent of damp earth and last year's fallen leaves. A local priest waited there, holding a slender rod cut from willow, a tree long believed to be sacred to the river's spirit. Though the priest recited the familiar Latin blessings, this was no ordinary sacrament. It was a public declaration, blending faith, folklore, and a tactical claim over rights of use. The ritual itself was quiet. She dipped her hands into the cold water, her breath rising in thin puffs. She spoke words that had been prepared for her. An invocation of partnership, respect, and endurance. It was said that she promised to honor the river's gifts and its dangers in equal measure. In response, the priest laid the willow rod across her wrists, as if binding her symbolically to the currents that flowed past her ankles. When she finally stepped back onto the grassy bank, her family's claim to draw water, to fish, and to graze cattle was reaffirmed in the eyes of those who mattered most, the neighboring lords who might otherwise have pressed their advantage. To break such a solemn vow would have risked inviting misfortune, both practical and spiritual. After all, in many corners of medieval life, there was little separation between a neighbor's ill will and a river's sudden flood. The girl returned home in the hush of early morning, her gown damp at the hem, the pearls cool against her throat. From that day forward, people called her not by her given name, but as the Bride of the River. It was an identity that seemed at once peculiar and powerful. Some believed the ritual had truly transformed her standing, that she had become, in some unseen way, an extension of the river's will. Others simply acknowledged it as a shrewd maneuver that settled a dispute without violence or the burden of drawn-out litigation. Over time, this legend grew softer at the edges. Later generations embellished it with details that likely never occurred. That she could command the water to rise or fall. That fish leapt into her baskets without a net. That drought never touched her orchard. But even the earliest records suggest that, at its core, this act was an expression of resilience. A family's determination to defend what they had built, using the language of ritual and the weight of tradition. Imagine yourself walking the path she took, feeling the hush that settles over a river before the first light of day. The world seems paused, waiting for a signal. You might notice how the grass bends under dew, how the current glides around an outcropping of stone. In that moment, you can almost sense how such a union might have felt. Not as a surrender, but as an unspoken agreement that life itself is always in negotiation with forces beyond your command. It's easy to underestimate how common such symbolic acts were. Across Europe, rivers and springs were often treated as entities with personality and power. Contracts could be blessed in their waters, oaths sworn at their banks. Some communities floated offerings downstream, wreaths of flowers, carved figurines, hoping to ensure a generous season. Others believed that neglecting these rites would bring ruin, as though the river would remember the slight and repay it in kind. In the centuries since, the land where this marriage was solemnized has changed again. Floods came and went. Fields were divided and redrawn. But in the quiet archives of a regional monastery, the record of this ceremony remained. A few lines inked on vellum, noting that a bride had stood before witnesses and pledged herself to the river's flow. When you let your imagination rest on that fragment of history, you might feel a curious comfort in the thought that lives were once shaped by such intimate gestures. A handful of words spoken at dawn, a footstep into cold water, a strand of pearls that caught the light. These were the instruments by which a family preserved its place in the world. No battles were fought. No wealth was squandered. Just a single morning when the river, for a moment, became more than a current. It became a partner in the rhythm of their lives. The son who refused to marry a map. Imagine yourself in the quiet study of a noble household, where thick wooden beams support a ceiling above tapestries muted with the passage of time. Maps and charters lay spread across a heavy oak table, the edges curling slightly with age. The scent of parchment mingles with the faint smoke from a distant hearth, and the air holds a gentle stillness that invites reflection. Here begins the story of a young heir, a son poised to inherit lands, titles, and a carefully constructed legacy, but one who chose to defy expectation and reject the path laid before him. In the medieval world, marriages among the nobility were rarely matters of personal affection. They were strategic alliances, carefully negotiated exchanges of wealth, power and influence. Imagine the weight carried by an arranged marriage, especially one whose dowry promised to triple the size of a family's holdings. A potential transformation that would ripple through the political landscape. This was the prize that awaited the young heir. A union meant to strengthen his family's position and weave new threads into their already intricate web of alliances. Yet the son refused. His rebellion was quiet but resolute. A rejection not only of the marriage, but of the very notion that his future could be dictated solely by maps and ledgers. Imagine the tension that arose from this refusal. The gentle but firm resistance against a destiny drawn in ink and ambition rather than heart and will. His decision sent ripples through the household, unsettling carefully balanced relationships and threatening the fragile network of loyalties that underpinned his family's power. The father, a man seasoned by years of political maneuvering, had envisioned a future secured through this marriage. The promise of expanding lands was a vision of stability amid a world marked by shifting allegiances and uncertain borders. Imagine the weight of that vision, the countless hours spent poring over maps, negotiating terms, and anticipating the benefits that would flow from the union. The son's refusal was not merely a personal choice. It was a challenge to this vision, a fissure in the foundation of the family's carefully crafted strategy. This tension played out not in grand halls filled with shouting or conflict, but in quiet rooms and hushed conversations. Imagine the careful words exchanged between counselors, the discreet meetings held behind closed doors, and the subtle recalibrations of alliances as the family grappled with the consequences. The rebellion was a quiet storm, one that threatened to unravel a web woven over generations. Yet, amid the uncertainty, the son's choice reflected a deeper current. It spoke to the human desire for autonomy, for a life shaped by more than the cold logic of land and title. Imagine the internal struggles he faced, the pull of duty against the call of self, the knowledge that refusal might bring not only familial disappointment, but social and political peril. His stand was a moment where individual will intersected with the relentless forces of tradition. The consequences were profound. The family's political network, delicately balanced and extensive, teetered on the edge of collapse. Allies questioned the stability of their bonds. Enemies watched for weakness, and the household itself braced for the fallout. Imagine the ripple effect. Negotiations stalled, support wavering, and the ever-present threat of disputes erupting into open conflict. The son's refusal was a turning point, a quiet rupture with echoes that stretched beyond the immediate family. Yet, life continued within the household's walls. The rhythm of daily tasks, the turning of seasons, and the passage of time wove a backdrop to this unfolding drama. Imagine the servants moving through corridors unaware of the full weight of the decision made in chambers above, the hunts proceeding through dewy forests, and the routine of meals and prayers that steadied the household amid uncertainty. This story, while particular in its details, reflects broader themes of medieval life, where duty and desire often collided, and where the maps drawn by power met the unpredictable courses charted by individual hearts. It reminds us that beneath the grand strategies of land and alliance were human lives marked by struggle, choice, and the delicate balance between tradition and change. So, imagine yourself once more in that quiet study, the son's refusal lingering in the still air, a silent testament to the tensions between inherited fate and personal will. In this moment lies a story not only of lands and dowries, but of a young man's quiet defiance, a reminder that even amid the vast tapestries of history, the threads of individual choice can ripple through time, shaping destinies in ways both subtle and profound. The castle dowry that made a servant queen. Imagine yourself in a small stone chamber, high in a fortified manor that was never meant to belong to a servant. The air is cool, thick with the scent of old timber beams and the faint trace of rushes that have been laid and relayed across the floors to freshen the space. You are standing in a place once reserved for lords and their stewards, But now the chamber belongs to a woman who began her life in the kitchens below. Her name has been largely forgotten, woven into regional records and land rolls rather than ballads or noble genealogies. Yet for a brief span of years, she held more power than the man she married, simply because a piece of parchment decreed that the castle, and all its rights, were hers. The story begins in a borderland, where small fortresses dotted the landscape like watchful sentinels. Many were not grand castles as you might imagine, more like fortified houses with thick walls, narrow windows, and towers just high enough to signal to the neighbors that this was not a place easily taken. These estates often passed from hand to hand, tangled in the shifting alliances of marriage, debt, and inheritance. In one such holding, a minor noble family, burdened by years of poor harvests and costly obligations to their overlords, gradually saw their fortunes decline. They retained a few loyal servants, among them a woman who tended the household accounts and oversaw the storage of grain and salted meat. Over decades, she became more than a servant. She was the keeper of secrets, the steady presence in times of famine and uncertainty. When the last male heir died without a legitimate child, a peculiar clause in an older deed was discovered. It stated that should the line fail, ownership of the estate would pass to the household's most senior servant, an arrangement originally devised to ensure the property remained cared for in troubled times. Few thought such a clause would ever be invoked, but in a world ruled by documents and seals as much as by sword and will, the parchment was undeniable. So it was that the woman who had once risen before dawn to tally sacks of flour awoke one morning as the mistress of a fortified estate. The transition was not as sudden in daily life as you might imagine. The rhythms of work continued. Bread had to be baked, fences mended, tenants came to present their rents, though they now bowed to her. She dressed in the same simple gown she had worn before, but a silver chain was added to her attire, a visible mark of her new station. For the first time, she sat in the high chair at the hall's end when judgments were rendered. She signed documents with a practiced but still careful hand, aware that each mark carried the weight of law. If you picture her there, perhaps you see a woman composed but quietly astonished at the power that had descended upon her life. Her status soon attracted suitors. Among them was a lesser nobleman whose own lands bordered hers. For him, marriage was a strategy to reclaim what his family had once controlled. To her, the prospect of union was more complicated. She was not young, and she understood that a marriage of convenience could bring stability, but also potential humiliation. Nevertheless, alliances in that era often relied on such calculations. Eventually, she agreed to marry, knowing that her property would secure her place in the broader web of local power. The wedding was modest, held in the chapel adjacent to the manor. Candles flickered along the rough-hewn walls, their light pooling on the stones. A few neighboring lords attended, curiosity mingling with politeness as they watched this unorthodox union. The ceremony itself followed the familiar ritual. Vows spoken, hands joined, a blessing murmured over the couple. Yet there was no concealing that she, a former servant, brought more wealth and influence to the marriage than her noble-born husband. In a culture preoccupied with lineage, this inversion of fortune was both unsettling and fascinating. Imagine yourself seated at the feast that followed, listening to the subdued conversations. The guests likely whispered about what would happen next. Would the husband assert control over the castle? Would she be quietly relegated back to the role of manager while he claimed the title? The reality was more nuanced. Although he adopted the outward symbols of authority, riding out to inspect the tenants, receiving petitions in the hall, the legal documents still bore her name. It was her seal that closed agreements. It was her consent that finalized decisions about rents and tithes. Daily life in the manor continued with its layered patterns. Servants still lit the hearth each morning. The kitchen remained the center of warmth and quiet gossip. But now, when disputes arose over boundaries or inheritance, it was she who was consulted. If you imagine her walking the curtain walls in the pale light of dawn, you can sense how power had settled around her like an unfamiliar cloak, weighty, protective, and perhaps a little isolating. This arrangement could not last indefinitely. In time, pressures mounted. Neighbors resented her position. Some accused her husband of scheming to acquire lands by marrying a woman who could not properly defend them. There were petitions to higher lords and inquiries from clerics who wondered whether the inheritance had been lawful. Through it all, she maintained a calm exterior, relying on the same habits that had guided her when she was merely a servant. Meticulous records, measured words, a refusal to be drawn into open conflict. Gradually, the novelty of her rule faded. The couple's fortunes stabilized as they negotiated alliances and settled disputes. Over the years, their marriage became less a curiosity and more an accepted fact. The servants who had once been her peers now regarded her with a mingled respect and distance. Those who visited the estate might never have guessed her origins unless they noticed the subtle ways she carried herself. More comfortable in the storehouse than in the solar, more confident tallying accounts than receiving flattery. In the end, her story did not conclude with a dramatic fall or sudden rise to greater glory. She remained the mistress of her castle until her death. When she passed, her husband retained the property, and their children inherited both the land and the peculiar legacy of a marriage that had begun not in love but in legal necessity. If you consider the rhythm of her life, you find not the sharp divisions of fortune and obscurity, but a continuous thread of diligence and quiet resilience. Perhaps there is a small comfort in knowing that history holds many such stories. Tales of individuals who found themselves unexpectedly powerful, whose lives remind us that the boundaries between service and sovereignty were sometimes as thin as a piece of parchment. Imagine yourself leaving the hall now, the hush of the chamber lingering in your ears, the image of a servant-turned-lady fading into the quiet corridors of the past, the wedding gift that came with a hidden army. Imagine yourself in a drafty medieval hall, the stone walls hung with faded banners that tell of old alliances and forgotten feuds. The air is cool and smells faintly of tallow candles and damp wool cloaks. This is where a noble wedding is about to take place. One that will be remembered not only for the bride's beauty or the wealth of her dowry, but for the curious and quietly unsettling gift that came with her hand in marriage. A parcel of land was granted to her, seemingly ordinary. Rolling pastures bordered by low hedges, a few orchards, and a scattering of tenants' cottages. Yet bound to this land, like roots beneath the soil, was the allegiance of 50 armed men. Such an arrangement might strike you as unusual. In a time when most brides brought chests of linens, parcels of land, or gold coins stamped with a king's seal, this gift stood apart. It was a statement, softly spoken but impossible to ignore. The bride did not arrive empty-handed, nor was she to be regarded as merely an ornament to her husband's household. Instead, she was the mistress of an estate fortified not only by fences and hedgerows, but by a company of seasoned warriors prepared to carry out her will. Picture her arrival at her new home. The roads would have been lined with villagers, their curiosity piqued by the spectacle of armed retainers riding alongside the bridal procession. Their armor was not polished to a ceremonial gleam, but worn with use, marked by countless campaigns. They were sworn men, bound by oaths that preceded her wedding day and would outlast many others. It was said among those who watched that these soldiers did not simply guard property. They were, in their quiet way, part of the dowry itself. For her husband, this unexpected clause brought both benefit and burden. The loyalty of 50 fighting men was no small asset in an age when disputes over grazing rights or ancestral claims could swiftly ignite into open conflict. Imagine the husband, seated beside the hearth in the evening, studying the scroll that outlined the marriage terms. he might have traced the inked names of those pledged to serve her, weighing the power now stitched to his household. If he was a prudent man, he would have understood that while these warriors might defend his interests, their first allegiance remained with his wife. In a sense, her father had ensured she would never be entirely subject to her husband's goodwill. You might wonder what daily life looked like under such an arrangement. Imagine the courtyard in the early morning, when the company of men trained beneath a pale sky. The rhythmic sound of wooden practice, swords striking shields would blend with the more familiar sounds of servants carrying buckets of water, and children calling to one another. At mealtimes, the soldiers ate together at long benches, separate from the household's other retainers. Their presence was both reassuring and quietly intimidating, a reminder that the noblewoman's influence was secured not only by legal writ, but by the promise of force. This was not an age when a woman's authority was always respected. But in this case, the hidden army ensured that her voice carried weight in decisions both public and private. When neighboring lords sent envoys to negotiate boundary disputes or arrange alliances, they understood that her words were backed by the capacity for immediate enforcement. A polite refusal, delivered in her calm voice, carried the same finality as a garrisoned gate. The men themselves were more than mercenaries. They were bound by hereditary ties to her family's lands. Some were the sons and grandsons of those who had served her ancestors. Their loyalty was a form of inheritance, passed down alongside weapons and crests. At harvest, they guarded the fields to prevent theft. In winter, they escorted supply wagons through snowbound roads. Their presence wove her into the life of the countryside, creating a network of obligation and protection that transcended marriage alone. Imagine the rhythms of her days. In the afternoons, she might walk the perimeter of her holdings, the soldiers accompanying her at a respectful distance. Their footfalls would soften on mossy paths, their watchful eyes scanning the hedgerows. She would pause to speak with tenants about yields or repairs, her authority unquestioned. Though some whispered that it was unseemly for a noblewoman to command armed men so openly, others saw in her a model of self-possession that quietly challenged the expectations of her time. Evenings in the hall were marked by a peculiar balance of formality and latent tension. When disputes arose, perhaps over rents or grazing land, she could summon her company's captain, a man whose bearing alone often settled arguments without a blade drawn. Over time, the region's petty lords learned to approach her household with a certain caution. Her husband, too, learned that while he was lord by marriage, she was not a passive partner in governance. It is easy to imagine the stories that took shape in the villages around her estate. Some claimed that she had engineered the entire arrangement, ensuring she would never be vulnerable. Others insisted her father had been the true architect, determined to secure her safety in a marriage that might otherwise have left her isolated. In truth, it was likely a little of both, a recognition that power in medieval society was seldom won by sentiment alone. Over the years, the company's role shifted with the seasons. In times of peace, they served as escorts for trade caravans and protectors of the harvest. In times of unease, they patrolled the roads and manned the small watchtower that overlooked a bend in the river. Always, their loyalty remained as constant as the turning of the year. For the noblewoman, it must have been a quiet reassurance, proof that her father's love had taken the shape of steel and discipline. Imagine her in later life, seated by a window overlooking the orchard. The men she had once commanded now older, their sons taking up the watch. The estate had grown prosperous under her guidance, its borders respected. The hidden army was no longer hidden, but simply part of the landscape, like the fields and hedgerows that marked her domain. She might have reflected on the paradox of her marriage, that she had been traded in part to forge an alliance, yet the power she carried had made her something more than a mere pawn. And so the wedding gift that came with a hidden army proved to be more than an unusual clause in a contract. It was a statement about the nature of authority in an uncertain world. In the hush of the hall, in the quiet discipline of 50 armed men, you can glimpse the quiet resilience of a woman who understood that power, once granted, need not be surrendered. The peasant girl who inherited a feudal dispute. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of a small, weathered village, where narrow dirt paths wind past humble cottages with thatched roofs, their walls thick with the scent of moss and smoke from wood fires. The daily rhythm here is steady and slow, measured by the rising sun, the crow of roosters, and the patient toil of peasants in the fields. Among them lived a young girl, unlettered and unaware that her life was about to be pulled into the unseen gears of feudal power and legal conflict. A world far beyond the simple labor she had known. This girl, like many of her station, was born into a life defined by the soil beneath her feet and the customs that governed the village. Illiteracy was common, for formal education rarely touched those who worked the land. Laws and documents existed in distant castles and courts, languages foreign to her ear, and scribes' ink-stained hands shaped fates in ways that villagers could scarcely imagine. Yet, in a turn that seemed ordinary at first, she was wed to a minor knight, a man of modest rank, but with just enough status to intertwine their lives with the complexities of feudal tenure. Marriage in this era was rarely a matter of personal choice or romantic affection, especially for those in the lower nobility or gentry, and certainly not for peasant families. It was a transaction, a social contract entwined with property, obligations, and sometimes disputes that could span years or decades. On her wedding day, the girl was given a deed, a legal instrument more significant than any gift or dowry. This deed transferred ownership of a patch of farmland, land long contested between her husband's family and a rival lord. Imagine the wedding feast. The scent of roasted meats mingling with the smoke of hearth fires, the muted laughter of neighbors and kin, the quiet prayers whispered in the chapel shadows. No one at the celebration explained the full weight of the deed she was signing into, nor the long-standing dispute that hung over the contested land like a heavy fog. To her, it was a formal document, perhaps an unfamiliar ritual, but to the lords and lawyers beyond the village, it was the key that unlocked a protracted legal battle. The disputed farmland was more than a piece of earth. It was a symbol of status, economic survival, and influence. Its fertile soil promised grain to feed families, pastures for livestock, and the leverage to command respect in the feudal hierarchy. Control over such land meant the right to collect rents from tenants, to assert jurisdiction, and to enforce customs. The minor knight's claim, reinforced by this wedding deed, was met with immediate resistance. The rival lord challenged the transfer, disputing the legitimacy of the marriage contract and the deed itself. Imagine now the slow churn of medieval justice. Far from the swift resolutions we might expect, courts convened in stone halls, where dusty tomes of law were read aloud by clerks in Latin, a language foreign to the villagers and even to many knights. The peasant girl, though central to this conflict, remained largely unaware of the legal wrangling that dictated her new reality. She was caught between worlds, the tangible labor of planting and harvest, and the intangible machinations of feudal law. As the dispute unfolded, the social fabric of the village felt the strain. Lords sent emissaries to assert claims, tax collectors increased their demands, and local peasants found themselves uncertain whom to serve. Imagine the whisper of conversations around hearth fires, the cautious glances exchanged in marketplaces, and the quiet fears of families whose livelihoods depended on the land's stability. The girl's position was delicate. As an illiterate peasant thrust into the role of legal owner, she bore the weight of claims and counterclaims without the tools to defend herself. Her husband's family, while of higher status, was minor and lacked the resources to immediately overpower their rivals. Instead, they relied on the slow grind of paperwork, oaths sworn before judges, and the testimony of witnesses, each document a brick in the fortress of their claim. Over months and years, the legal war dragged on, echoing through courtrooms and councils far removed from the village's quiet fields. The girl's life was irrevocably altered, her identity transformed from a simple village daughter to a symbol of contested ownership. The deed she signed in a moment of ceremony bound her to a feud that neither she nor her neighbors fully understood. Yet amid this struggle, life continued. Imagine the feel of the plow's handle in rough hands, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting from humble ovens, and the steady rhythm of seasons turning. The peasant girl lived in a world where daily survival depended on the land's yield and the protection of a lord's justice. However fractured it might be, this story reveals the complexities of feudal society, where legal ownership was not always clear-cut, and where even those at the margins could become pawns in larger disputes. It shows how marriage served as a conduit not just for family alliances, but for the transfer of power, often without the full consent or understanding of those involved. Imagine how many other lives were similarly caught in these quiet conflicts, their personal stories folded into the larger tapestry of medieval politics. In reflecting on the peasant girl's experience, we see a world where law and life were inseparable, yet often mismatched. The rhythms of village labor and the distant echoes of legal battles shaped one another in subtle ways. Her tale is a reminder that history's grand events are also composed of countless small stories. Stories of people who, despite their lack of power or knowledge, found themselves at the crossroads of change. As you settle into the calm, perhaps imagine this girl standing at the edge of her village, watching fields stretch toward the horizon. The weight of unseen documents and contested claims may press upon her, but the earth beneath her feet remains, steady and enduring. The legal war she inherited is part of a long, quiet story. A story of how ownership, law, and personal lives intertwined in the medieval world, often without warning, and always with lasting impact. The couple forced to marry or forfeit the forest. Imagine yourself at the edge of an old-growth forest, where the trees rise like silent sentinels and the light filters through canopies so dense that no breeze can reach the forest floor. This place was more than a collection of trunks and leaves. In medieval times, a forest meant livelihood. Timber for building, firewood for warmth, grazing for swine, and the subtle prestige that came from owning a place no peasant could enter without permission. The story you are about to hear is about two families, joined not by affection or gradual courtship, but by the command of a baron who decided that their quarrel had inconvenienced him long enough. These families had shared the forest for generations. Picture it. Every year, each household would send laborers to mark the trees they claimed, gather fallen limbs, and watch over the game that strayed into their portion. Over time, their claims became tangled. Who owned the clearing by the stream? Who had the right to cut winter oak? Who was entitled to hunt boar when the leaves began to turn? Disputes over property boundaries became disputes over pride. What began as measured complaints evolved into thefts, then skirmishes, and finally, acts of sabotage. A fence pulled down, a hunting dog poisoned. The baron who ruled over them had grown weary of receiving petitions and demands, of dispatching stewards to measure stumps and count tracks in the mud. In a world where a noble's power rested upon the illusion of order, this forest feud risked becoming a symptom of weakness. And so, in an act both practical and severe, he summoned the elders of both families to his hall and laid out a simple condition. They could merge their interests, binding their households in marriage, or they could forfeit all rights to the disputed land, watching as it reverted to the baron's control. Imagine the hush that must have fallen across the chamber when this was pronounced. To refuse meant surrendering the ancient privileges that gave the families their standing. But to consent meant forcing a daughter and a son, young people who had grown up as rivals, to share a life neither had chosen. Their opinions were not the ones that counted. This was a time when property could outweigh sentiment, when a union arranged under duress could still be recorded as legitimate. The wedding was organized with brisk efficiency. It took place at the forest's edge, in a clearing where the Baron's men had built a makeshift dais. A narrow path had been cut through the bracken to allow the bride's procession. She wore a gown of rough-spun wool, dyed a somber brown, and her hair was bound under a veil that barely concealed the stiffness in her posture. The groom stood some distance away, his face carefully composed into the blank expression expected of him. Witnesses from each family gathered, but they did not mingle. Instead, they stood in two silent groups, each watching the other with suspicion that no priestly blessing could dissolve. Under armed watch, the couple signed their names to the marriage record. The notary described them as consenting parties, though anyone present could see they had exchanged not a single word. The priest intoned the familiar blessings, but his voice sounded hollow against the forest's quiet. When it came time to join hands, they did so as if performing a task, a formality that must be completed before they were allowed to retreat to opposite ends of the clearing. It is worth pausing here to consider the landscape that surrounded them. To you, a forest might appear as a place of calm, a tangle of trunks and leaves offering solace. But in medieval Europe, forests were contested realms, symbols of power and wealth. The ability to cut timber or graze livestock without interference was no small matter. For many families of modest rank, such rights were the only distinction that separated them from mere tenants. When the Baron imposed this marriage, he was not simply ending a quarrel. He was ensuring the forest continued to generate revenue and respect, rather than serving as the backdrop for petty hostilities. The newly married couple departed in opposite directions, escorted by their kin. In some accounts, they did not share a household for months, only presenting themselves together when summoned by the Baron to confirm that the marriage had been consummated. This, too, was an obligation that allowed little room for feeling. It was simply another line to be recorded in the ledger, another reassurance that the forest was no longer in dispute. Over the years, a quiet legend grew around their union. Some said that, despite their mutual reluctance, the couple eventually developed a kind of partnership, a cautious respect born of shared responsibility. Others believed that their lives remained parallel but never entwined, like two tracks carved into the soil that never quite met. Imagine yourself walking that forest path long after the last witnesses had departed. The trees would stand indifferent, their branches shifting in the same wind that once stirred the bride's veil. If you closed your eyes, you might hear the echo of voices debating who owned the glade where you stood, and perhaps you would feel the faint trace of obligation in the air. The knowledge that a single decision could shape not only land and title, but the most private corners of a person's life. Today, the forest remains, though the names of those families have faded. The record of their forced marriage still sits in an archive, a brittle parchment inscribed with signatures written under duress. It tells a story that is neither romance nor outright tragedy, but something quieter and more enduring. The way property and authority could harness the lives of ordinary people, guiding them into unions that were less about devotion than about the preservation of order. In the end, the forest grew as it always had, indifferent to the agreements forged beneath its boughs. The marriage fulfilled its purpose. The Baron's ledger remained untroubled, and two people carried the memory of that morning all their lives. A memory shaped as much by duty as by the whispering trees that watched it all unfold. The dowry chest that contained a kingdom's debt. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit chamber of a medieval castle, where the scent of aged wood mingles with the faint, dusty aroma of parchment and leather. Before you rests a large, sturdy chest, its iron fittings worn and scratched, its wood heavy with secrets. This is no ordinary dowry chest, laden with glittering jewels or fine fabrics. Instead, within its depths lies a collection of documents. IOUs penned in careful script, legal papers stamped with seals, and meticulous records of land taxes owed. This chest embodies not wealth in coin or gold, but a kingdom's debt, silently passing power from one hand to another. In medieval society, dowries were often thought of as treasures, gifts that cemented alliances and secured futures. Yet, not all dowries were composed of silver and silk. Imagine a young bride arriving at her new home, bringing with her not riches to adorn her marriage, but a complex web of obligations. A burden carried in ink and parchment rather than in precious metals. Her dowry was a transfer not merely of property, but of responsibility over a troubled and indebted region. The documents within the chest reveal the intricate financial and political realities of the time. IOUs bound the landowners to creditors, legal papers dictated rights and privileges, and tax records chronicled dues owed to lords or monarchs. Imagine the weight these papers held, not just physically but in the lives of those who labored the soil, paid the rents, and lived under the shadow of economic strain. The bride's marriage thus became a contract entwined with the fate of an entire region, where power was exercised through debts and obligations as much as through sword and title. This dowry chest tells a story of strategy and survival. Families negotiated marriages not only to gain wealth, but to consolidate control over territories facing economic hardship. Imagine the calculating minds of nobles weighing the risks and benefits. Accepting a dowry heavy with debt meant inheriting the challenge of governance, but also the potential to shape and restore the region's fortunes. The bride, often young and unassuming, was at the center of this transaction, a living symbol of alliance and transfer of authority. The impact of such a dowry rippled beyond the castle walls. Imagine the peasants and tenants who tilled the lands burdened by these debts, their lives affected by the shifting hands of power. The new lord, empowered by the dowry documents, held sway over their fates, deciding on rents, justice, and protection. The chest's contents were more than paper. They were keys to control and the weight of responsibility, carried silently into the marriage chamber. Yet, amid these complexities, the dowry chest also reflects the delicate interplay of trust and risk. The bride's family might hope that through marriage, debts could be managed or renegotiated, alliances strengthened, and stability restored. The husband's family, in accepting this burden, accepted a gamble, a chance to wield influence over lands fraught with financial difficulty but rich in strategic value. Imagine the quiet calculations behind sealed agreements, the unspoken hopes and fears woven into every line of script. This narrative invites us to see beyond the glitter of medieval weddings to the intricate realities beneath. Dowries were not mere gifts but instruments of power, sometimes laden with challenges disguised as opportunities. Imagine how each page in that chest carried stories of negotiation, hope, and the unyielding demands of medieval politics. So, as you stand before that heavy chest, feel the weight not only of wood and iron, but of history's complexities, the debts and duties that shaped lives and kingdoms. In this coffer lies a kingdom struggle, handed over not with fanfare, but in quiet papers sealed with intent, a testament to the enduring interplay of power, responsibility, and the fragile threads that bind families and realms together. The girl who was married to settle a land curse. Imagine yourself in a remote valley, where the land seems to breathe beneath the early morning mist, and where people measure time not by clocks, but by the pattern of planting and reaping. In this valley, there was a belief so old that no one could say when it had begun. It was said that a curse lay upon a particular stretch of farmland, a broad, low plain near the river, where the soil turned black in the rains and refused to yield a decent harvest. The curse was whispered to have started with a betrayal between two families, sealed by an oath that no crop would flourish there until a marriage joined the rivals again. For generations, the land stood as a reminder of that old quarrel. Each season, tenant farmers would attempt to plant barley and rye, only to watch the seedlings wither under the same bright sun that nourished other fields. Livestock that grazed near the cursed soil sometimes sickened. Even the trees at the margins grew twisted and sparse, their branches draped in a grayish moss. The noble families, whose ancestors had first divided and disputed the territory, carried the shame like a hidden scar. The turning point came in a year when famine threatened. Harvests across the region were meager, and desperation blurred the lines between superstition and necessity. One of the lords, an aging man with more debts than heirs, decided that the time had come to end the curse by any means that tradition allowed. Among the customs preserved in local memory was the idea that an oath of union, a marriage solemnized upon the disputed ground, might restore the land's fertility. Whether this was folklore or a distorted recollection of some ancient rite, no one could say for certain. But when crops failed and creditors pressed at the gate, even the most skeptical minds looked for signs of deliverance. The nobleman had a daughter, a quiet young woman who rarely left the manor's upper chambers. She was known for her skill at embroidery and her careful observance of religious festivals. From the little that survives in letters and inventories, it seems she was neither rebellious nor particularly timid, only accustomed to a life shaped by her father's decisions. So it was that, when he announced she would marry the son of the rival family, she did not protest. In those times, obedience was often the clearest path to survival. The wedding was planned with a mixture of urgency and ceremony. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the cursed field as dawn broke on the appointed day. A narrow wooden platform had been built for the priest and witnesses. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and the faint bitterness of old leaves decaying in the furrows. Guests gathered in hushed clusters, their breath visible in the cold. Though the event was meant to heal a fracture in the land's memory, there was little joy among those who watched. The bride wore a gown of undyed linen, a sign of modesty and sacrifice. The groom, scarcely older than she, kept his gaze lowered through most of the ritual. When the vows were spoken, they were accompanied by the soft murmuring of the crowd, a chorus of hope and dread. The priest sprinkled blessed water along the boundary stones, reciting prayers that blended Christian rites with older, less official phrases. As the final words of the ceremony echoed across the fields, a hush settled, as though even the trees were waiting to see if the earth itself would respond. In the weeks that followed, an astonishing change was recorded. The fields began to show green shoots that did not wither. Rain fell evenly, soaking the soil without flooding it. By midsummer, stalks of grain stood taller than any could remember, and the superstition seemed at last to have been undone. Neighbors from distant villages came to see the fields, to touch the smooth heads of barley as proof that curses could be lifted by human hands. The noble families, once divided by suspicion, held a joint feast to celebrate. It was said that, for a brief time, no household in the valley wanted for bread. Yet while the land flourished, the young bride began to recede from daily life. At first, she simply spent more time indoors, pleading weariness or piety when called to join the harvest blessings. Then she stopped attending the small gatherings of her kin altogether. Servants noted that her chamber remained shuttered, even on clear days. Some claimed to have glimpsed her at night, walking the edges of the newly restored fields as though listening for something that no one else could hear. One morning, she was gone. The bed was unslept in. A narrow gate that opened toward the river stood ajar. Though searches were conducted, and inquiries made along the banks and in neighboring settlements, no trace of her was found. In time, rumors grew to fill the silence she left behind. Some said the land had exacted a final payment for its bounty. Others believed she had simply fled, disoriented by the burden of a union meant to serve a purpose beyond her own life. Despite her disappearance, the fields remained fertile. Year after year, the harvests were plentiful. Tenants prospered. The noble families grew wealthy enough to repair their manors and extend their holdings. In time, the story of the cursed land was told as a cautionary tale and a curiosity. Older farmers would still point to the smooth, dark soil and speak of the girl who vanished when the land was healed. But in the official accounts, ledgers, tax rolls, legal documents, her name appeared only as a notation beside the date of her marriage, followed by a blank space where any further record should have been. If you imagine yourself walking the fields today, you might find it hard to believe they were ever thought accursed. The earth lies quiet, generous with whatever seed is entrusted to it. Yet in the hush of early morning, when the mist hangs low and the air tastes of rain, you can almost sense the lingering memory of a time when people believed the land itself could remember wrongs and require a life to set them right. In that stillness, her story feels close, as if she might step through the rising fog to continue the tale that history left unfinished. The marriage that split a castle in half forever. Imagine yourself standing before a castle whose silhouette seems whole at first glance. But as you approach the weathered walls, you notice the small peculiarities that betray its secret. A faint line of differently dressed stone runs up the keep. Two separate gates yawn open on either side of the drawbridge, each with a different banner fluttering overhead. The courtyard is bisected by a tall wooden palisade, and beyond it, you glimpse another household moving about with their own rhythm, separate yet impossibly close. This is the legacy of a marriage that fractured a stronghold into two domains, a quiet testament to the stubbornness of bloodlines and the complexity of medieval inheritance. To understand how such an arrangement took root, you must first imagine the world these families inhabited. Land was not simply property. It was power, identity, and leverage. When a marriage united two noble houses, it was expected that lands would merge as well, forging a consolidated domain. But here, the question of dowry, how much land and wealth should pass with the bride, ignited a conflict neither side could surrender without dishonor. Negotiations stretched on, season after season, as clerics and legal advisors gathered in candlelit chambers to pore over family charters and ancient deeds. Picture the narrow chamber where the final settlement was drafted, the air thick with the scent of parchment and beeswax, the voices of aging stewards reciting lineage claims in tones so dry they could lull even the most determined litigant to sleep. Yet behind the measured words, a deep unease pulsed. If no compromise were reached, the dispute could spark open hostility. At last, a compromise was proposed so peculiar it seemed almost absurd. Rather than divide the land surrounding the castle, or force a sale, the families would split the castle itself. Each household would claim half of the keep, half of the courtyard, half of the storerooms and stables. The line of division would be inscribed into the very architecture. Imagine the first months of this new arrangement. One newlywed couple occupied the southern hall, their chambers warmed by a massive hearth decorated with a carved griffin. Just beyond a hastily constructed wall, the other family kept to their northern quarters. The kitchens were divided by planks so thin you could hear the clatter of ladles and the low conversations of cooks on the other side. The well in the courtyard had to be shared, and disputes over its use quickly became a recurring drama. Servants developed elaborate routines to avoid crossing paths. Children were taught to recognize which doorways were safe to pass through, and which might provoke confrontation. Over time, the rhythms of daily life settled into something almost normal, if never quite comfortable. Imagine the muffled sound of footsteps on the other side of a dividing wall as you drifted to sleep. The gentle hiss of steam from the neighboring hearth filtering under the threshold. It was an intimacy without fellowship. Two lineages sharing a roof yet locked in a quiet, enduring competition. Each household hung their own tapestries, maintained their own chapel, and conducted their own affairs as if the other side did not exist. The passing decades turned the original newlyweds into elders, then memories. Yet the legal settlement proved more tenacious than any lifespan. Children inherited the same division, along with the same grudges and occasional small gestures of reconciliation. You might imagine a cold winter morning when firewood grew scarce. A servant from the southern hall would slip a few logs across the threshold, acknowledging, if only briefly, that survival sometimes demanded cooperation. Then the quiet truce would fade, and the customary wariness would return. Architecture itself began to reflect the arrangement. Separate staircases were constructed, so no one need pass through the other household's domain. Windows were bricked up to preserve privacy, or else fitted with shutters that could be bolted tight. In one chamber, a tapestry was hung across a door, its embroidery depicting a single tree whose roots sprawled in both directions. Perhaps a subtle reminder that however fiercely the families clung to separation, they shared the same foundations. Over generations, the dual occupation shaped the castle's character in ways that might seem almost comical to an outsider. Two stewards managed duplicate inventories of tools and livestock. Two chaplains offered prayers in adjoining chapels, their voices sometimes echoing through the same corridors. Even the dogs learned to respect the boundary, their barks shifting in pitch when another household's hound drew near. Yet for all its strangeness, this arrangement also held a certain resilience. In an age when disputes often ended in violence, this compromise had allowed two proud families to coexist, if only barely. There were quarrels, certainly. There were episodes when a gate was barred, or a feast interrupted by the accusation that one side had overstepped some ancient privilege. But there were also quieter moments of mutual recognition. A child from one household falling ill, and a healer summoned from the other side. A marriage years later between distant cousins that suggested perhaps the old bitterness was losing its grip. Imagine standing in the courtyard now, centuries later. The palisade that once enforced the division has long since decayed, replaced by a low wall of mossy stone. Yet the memory of the divide endures in the architecture itself. Doorways leading to nowhere, staircases ending at bricked-in arches. Two kitchens whose hearths were never joined. Guides point out these details to visitors, recounting the story of the marriage that split a castle in half forever. For many, it is a curiosity, a relic of a time when inheritance laws were as tangled as ivy on the battlements. But if you pause in one of the old chambers and listen, you might still feel the faint echo of those parallel lives. Two families moving in synchronized solitude, bound together by the same walls, yet never quite reconciled. Their story is a reminder that in the medieval world, compromise was often imperfect, and peace was sometimes measured not in friendship, but in the endurance of an uneasy truce. The young wife traded for a contested village. Imagine yourself in a time when the land was the lifeblood of power, and villages were more than just clusters of homes. They were sources of wealth, influence, and survival. The rhythm of life was marked by seasons of planting and harvest. But beneath this steady pulse, an intricate dance of alliances and claims shaped the destinies of families and realms alike. It was in this delicate world that a young woman's fate was rewritten. Not by her own hand, but by the ink that traced lines on a map and the decisions made in shadowed chambers far from her knowing. This young woman was a bride-to-be, her engagement a promise of union, hope, and new beginnings. The village where she grew up was modest, its cottages nestled among fields rich with golden grain and pastures where sheep grazed quietly. Imagine the soft sounds of everyday life, the clucking of hens, the gentle murmur of the nearby stream, the lowing of cattle settling for the night. Her family, like many others, understood marriage as both a personal milestone and a social contract, a weaving of kinship and resources meant to secure futures. Yet, as the date of her wedding approached, unforeseen currents shifted the course of her life. The lord to whom she was promised had advisors, men skilled in the subtleties of politics and property, guardians of their lord's interests. It was these advisors who, through careful study of charters, land claims, and obscure rights, uncovered something unexpected. A rival village nearby could be legally claimed if the bride's engagement was redirected. This rival village, nestled in the folds of rolling hills and fertile fields, represented not just more land, but a valuable foothold in the Lord's expanding influence. Imagine the soft scratching of quills on parchment as the advisors altered plans, redrawing lines on maps with precise strokes. The bride's engagement was suddenly transferred, not through her own choice, but through the decisions of those who saw in her a key to unlocking greater power. Her original betrothed, once the focus of her future, was replaced by another noble whose claim aligned with this new strategy. Her name and likeness became part of negotiations conducted in cold rooms where the scent of beeswax and parchment hung thick in the air. This exchange was not merely about marriage. It was a transaction of territories, a delicate shifting of borders dictated by law and custom. Imagine the legal documents, sealed with wax and stamped with heraldic symbols, passing from hand to hand. Each signature confirmed the transfer of rights, the inclusion of the bride's family lands into the new lord's domain. The young woman, unaware of the full implications, was moved like a piece on a chessboard. Her personal hopes entwined with the ambitions of powerful men. Her new role as bride tied her to the contested village, a place whose ownership was fiercely debated among local lords. The village itself was a patchwork of farmsteads, narrow lanes, and a small church whose bells tolled over fields thick with wildflowers. Its people lived by the seasons, tending crops and livestock, their lives shaped by the lords who claimed jurisdiction. Control over this village meant authority to collect rents, enforce laws, and wield influence in regional councils. The young bride's marriage was the linchpin in securing these rights. As she moved to her new home, imagine the sensation she might have experienced. The unfamiliar sense of a different hearth, the texture of new tapestries in a stone manor, the subtle shift in accents and customs. The life she had anticipated was altered by the silent power of maps and contracts. The fate inscribed by ink on parchment dictated where she belonged, whose banner she would stand beneath, and what future awaited her. This story reveals the profound ways in which personal lives were shaped by the interplay of law, politics, and property in the medieval world. It illustrates how a bride's destiny could be redirected by forces far beyond her control. A reminder that marriage was often a tool wielded in the pursuit of power rather than simply a union of hearts. Imagine the countless others whose lives were quietly altered by similar transactions, their stories folded into the larger narrative of territorial ambition and feudal governance. Yet amid these shifts, daily life persisted. The villagers continued to sow and reap, to celebrate festivals and endure hardships, their routines marking time even as borders changed on distant maps. The bride's journey was a thread woven into this ongoing tapestry, an intimate reflection of the tension between personal experience and the grand designs of power. As you settle into the gentle calm of this tale, perhaps you can picture the young woman standing at the threshold of her new village, feeling the weight of unseen decisions and the promise of a life redefined by ink and intention. The exchange that shifted her fate is a quiet testament to the complexities of medieval life, where the boundaries of land and loyalty were as much drawn by quills as by swords, and where one person's path could change with the stroke of a pen. The groom who didn't know he'd married a port. Imagine yourself standing on a salt-crusted dock, the masts of ships rising like a forest of slender trees against the hazy horizon. The air smells of tar and brine, of rope left too long in the sun. In this place, every crate and barrel could mean fortune or failure. During the late medieval period, ports were more than harbors. They were the beating hearts of commerce, the thresholds through which entire regions exchanged their wealth, ideas, and ambitions. This is the story of a man who stepped into marriage believing he was sealing a polite alliance with a distant cousin, only to discover that her dowry carried something far greater than any ordinary inheritance. The groom was a sea captain of modest but rising reputation, known among merchants for his cautious temperament. He did not gamble on speculation or overextend his credit. Each venture was weighed, each ledger tallied to the last copper penny. He had spent years building a small fleet, plying familiar routes along the coast. His ambitions, while steady, were constrained by the limits of port access and docking fees. His bride, by contrast, was the last surviving child of a family whose fortunes had thinned over generations. To outward appearances, her dowry consisted of a few chests of silver plate, some inherited linens, and the modest revenues from an estate inland. The marriage had been arranged by intermediaries, and the couple met only weeks before the ceremony. At the time, this was neither unusual nor cause for regret. Marriage was as much an instrument of property management as of personal connection. Imagine the wedding itself, a subdued affair held in the stone chapel of a merchant guild hall. The windows, leaded and narrow, let in only thin shafts of light. Guests sat in neat rows, murmuring their observations. How the bride's gown looked recut from her mother's, how the groom's coat had been carefully brushed but still smelled faintly of the ship's hold. There was no orchestra, only a single viol to accompany the solemn Latin rites. When they exchanged vows, neither could have guessed that the most significant detail of their union rested not in words, but in a folded sheaf of parchment, tied with red cord, waiting in a chest nearby. It was not until days later, when the groom's clerk began the work of inventorying the dowry, that the truth emerged. Among the predictable lists of household goods and debts, there lay a deed, dry with age and written in the intricate hand of a long-dead scribe. It was the legal title to a modest shipping port along the coast, a place the groom had visited often but never imagined he might control. In the centuries since, some storytellers have claimed he burst into laughter when he realized what he had acquired. Others suggest he stood in stunned silence, turning the parchment over and over as if its meaning would vanish if he looked away. Imagine how the world must have appeared to him in that moment. The entire machinery of his trade had been transformed overnight. No longer would he negotiate docking fees or await the goodwill of the port stewards. No longer would he pay duties to unload or store his cargo. He could expand his fleet without fear of being edged out by more established rivals. What had begun as a careful marriage of convenience had shifted into an unanticipated stroke of advantage. Yet it would be misleading to say that all was simple from that day forward. Owning a port was no small undertaking. The groom faced a swift education in managing stevedores, maintaining breakwaters, and arbitrating the many small disputes that arose whenever cargo changed hands. There were legal challenges, too. Distant relatives of his bride who contested the bequest, and local guilds wary of his influence. But unlike the older merchant dynasties, who had inherited such privileges across generations, he possessed a certain vigor that came from having worked for every rung of the ladder he had climbed. Imagine the first time he sailed his flagship into the harbor as both captain and master of the port itself. The tide would have been running out, the sea rippling under the pale dawn light. Dockworkers would have stood along the pilings, watching the familiar vessel approach, perhaps unaware that the man on the quarterdeck had become their new overseer. It must have been a curious moment. The same ship, the same crew, but an entirely different relationship to the land upon which they anchored. In time, the marriage itself settled into something more companionable than expected. The bride, who had grown up hearing her father complain of the burdens of port ownership, found herself quietly satisfied that her husband seemed not overwhelmed, but invigorated by his responsibilities. Together, they restructured tariffs to encourage foreign traders. They built new warehouses, attracting commerce that had once bypassed the harbor. Where once the town had been little more than a minor stop between larger cities, it began to acquire a reputation as a place where goods could be landed swiftly and contracts enforced reliably. The groom's fleet multiplied. Timber was imported from the Baltic, spices from distant coasts, bolts of cloth from Italy. Each success could be traced back to that single folded deed, tucked into a dowry chest almost as an afterthought. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking along those piers centuries ago, You might hear the steady creak of the rope under strain, the cries of sailors hauling cargo, the low hum of deals being struck. It is easy to forget that behind every bustling harbor lay stories of marriage contracts and property negotiations. Arrangements that might have seemed dull on the day they were signed, but later altered the entire course of a community's fortunes. The groom who did not know he had married a port became a legend in merchant circles. In later years, rivals liked to say he had stumbled into prosperity by accident. But those who knew him better understood that luck alone could not sustain such success. It required discipline, a keen eye for opportunity, and the humility to learn swiftly what others had been raised to expect. His story remains as a reminder that in the medieval world, as in our own, the most consequential changes sometimes arrive not with fanfare or deliberate design, but in the quiet unfolding of a document, in the realization that a life has been transformed by a single stroke of ink. And so the harbor endured, long after his ships were gone, its stones shaped by tides, trade, and the memory of a marriage that no one, least of all the groom, had fully understood until it was far too late to turn away. The bride whose dowry was a burning mill. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of a village nestled beside a winding river, where the steady rhythm of a millstone turning once marked the pulse of daily life. The scent of freshly ground grain mingled with the earthy aroma of damp timber and moss. This mill was not just a building. It was a symbol of wealth, influence, and sustenance, its steady work providing grain to bakers, families, and markets alike. Now, picture the day of a wedding when this very mill, promised as part of a bride's dowry, suddenly became engulfed in flames, smoke curling into the sky, and the rhythmic hum of industry replaced by crackling fire. The bride's arrival was meant to solidify alliances and bring prosperity. Dowries often included land, livestock, and vital businesses like mills, which were lucrative assets that granted economic and social standing. Imagine the hopeful faces of families gathered for the celebration, unaware that beneath the festivities lurked tensions and rivalries. The burning mill was more than misfortune. It was a stark and sudden disruption, a physical and symbolic blow to the bride's power and her family's standing. Rumors quickly spread through the village and beyond, whispered in shadows and taverns alike. Many believed the fire was no accident, but a deliberate act, set by the husband's kin to diminish the bride's influence and weaken her claim to the valuable asset. Imagine the murmur of suspicion threading through the crowd, the uneasy glances exchanged as neighbors weighed truth against gossip. Such acts of sabotage were not uncommon in times when property and power were fiercely contested, especially within families navigating the fragile balance of alliances. The loss of the mill was a blow that rippled far beyond charred beams and ruined machinery. For the bride, it meant not only the destruction of promised wealth, but also an undermining of her position within the household and the wider community. Imagine her standing amidst the smoldering ruins, the weight of betrayal heavy upon her, while her husband's family moved to consolidate control over what remained. The fire served as a harsh reminder that dowries, while symbols of union, were also battlegrounds where power was negotiated and contested. Yet, the story of the burning mill also reflects the precariousness of medieval life, where prosperity could be as fragile as the flicker of a flame. Mills required constant maintenance and protection, vulnerable to both accident and intent. Imagine the villagers' resilience as they confronted loss. How grain had to be ground elsewhere, debts recalculated, and alliances reconsidered. The fire altered the rhythm of daily life, reminding all how intertwined wealth, power, and family could be. This incident invites reflection on the broader dynamics of medieval marriages and property. Dowries were not merely gifts, but complex transfers of assets that could spark conflict and intrigue. Imagine the delicate dance of trust and suspicion that accompanied such arrangements, where the merging of families was shadowed by competing interests and the ever-present struggle for advantage. As you envision the smoldering mill once more, See not only the destruction, but also the stories etched into the ashes. The tensions, hopes, and betrayals that shaped a young bride's life and the fate of her dowry. In this quiet catastrophe lies a narrative of power contested, alliances tested, and the fragile flame of prosperity threatened by those closest. So, imagine yourself at the village's edge, watching smoke rise from what was once a steady heartbeat of the community. The burning mill stands as a testament to the complexities of medieval marriage, where wealth and power were never guaranteed, and where even the strongest promises could be reduced to ashes in a single, deliberate act. The wedding that hid a secret tax loophole. Imagine yourself in a candlelit chamber where the walls are lined with wooden chests, each brimming with brittle scrolls and folded parchments stamped with heavy seals. This is not a grand hall or a chapel, but a small room where a quiet kind of power is exercised. The power of ledgers, statutes, and legal language, so carefully arranged it can tilt the fortunes of entire families. Here, on a winter evening long forgotten by most, a marriage was arranged not out of affection or ambition, but to exploit an obscure clause in tax law that had lain dormant for decades. The family at the center of this story had once been prosperous, their estates spreading across several valleys, with tenants who paid rent in grain and labor. But over the years, debts had accumulated, some from failed harvests, some from costly obligations to their overlords, and still others from the slow erosion of wealth that came with maintaining the outward appearance of prosperity. When taxes came due, the nobleman who held the estate discovered that the levy on transferring property between kin had grown ruinous. Transferring land between father and son, or among siblings, required a substantial payment to the crown. But hidden in the tangle of regulations was a curious exemption. If the land passed to a spouse through marriage, no such tax was collected. This clause, likely drafted generations earlier to ease the unification of estates through marital alliances, now offered an unexpected reprieve to those clever, or desperate, enough to use it. It was not illegal to marry solely for financial reasons, nor was it unheard of. But to create a union with no intention of ever sharing a roof was another matter. The nobleman understood that appearances mattered as much as law, so everything had to be arranged with meticulous care. The chosen bride was a distant cousin, connected by blood, but so remote that few had ever met her. She had been raised in a convent on the far side of the county, her life measured in hours of prayer and small, steady labors. By all accounts, she was neither unwilling nor particularly interested in the arrangement. She would remain in the convent after the ceremony, her daily life unchanged except in name. The groom was the nobleman's second son, a quiet young man who showed no inclination to object. His elder brother stood to inherit the main seat of the family's power, and he understood that this peculiar marriage was the only means to preserve the smaller estate without selling it outright. On the day of the wedding, the manor's chapel was hung with modest garlands of evergreen. A few witnesses were gathered, servants and stewards sworn to discretion. The priest conducted the ceremony with the same gravity he would have offered to any union, his voice echoing across the stone floor. If you imagine yourself among those in attendance, you might have sensed a faint unease beneath the solemnity. Each participant understood that the vows, while legally binding, were a formality. The couple exchanged rings, and the bride's gloved hand trembled only slightly as she spoke her responses. After the blessing, they signed the register, the ink drying quickly in the cold air. When the ceremony concluded, no feast followed. The bride returned to the convent in a closed carriage. The groom retired to his own chambers. In the official records, however, the marriage was as legitimate as any other, and the estate passed into her name without triggering the tax. Over the months that followed, she leased the property back to her new family, another transaction permitted under the law, so that little in practice changed. The tenants paid rent to the same overseer. The fields were plowed in the same careful rows. But the crown's collectors, finding the paperwork in order, demanded no further payment. This arrangement might have remained a family secret forever, if not for the diligence of a royal auditor. Years later, when a broader review of estate transfers was conducted, the marriage appeared in a list of exemptions. A clerk, noting the unusual circumstance that neither party had ever moved residence, sent inquiries. Affidavits were produced, each confirming that the union had been freely entered, and that no law forbade such a marriage of convenience. Though some officials grumbled that the spirit of the statute had been violated, the letter of the law was clear, and no penalty could be imposed retroactively. Imagine for a moment the bride's life within the convent walls. Though technically married, she continued to rise before dawn to attend matins. Her small cell remained unchanged, its narrow bed and shelf of devotional texts undisturbed by her new title. The marriage brought her a modest allowance, which she used to improve the convent's kitchen and to commission candles for the chapel. When letters arrived from the estate, they were addressed to her formally, but she rarely responded. To the sisters around her, she was simply a woman who had been drawn into a distant family's intricate arrangements. As for the groom, he lived quietly on the family lands. He never married again. Some accounts suggest he grew fond of the quiet respectability the arrangement afforded him, free of obligations or expectations. In time, his older brother's line failed, and he inherited the main seat of the family holdings. When he died decades later, the records of his first and only marriage still carried the same precise language. Solemnized in the chapel, witnessed by 7 people, and recognized by both church and crown. If you stand back and consider this story, you see not only a clever evasion of taxation, but also a window into a world where law, custom, and human necessity intertwined in ways that could seem almost theatrical. The rhythms of medieval life were shaped as much by what was written on parchment as by the turning of seasons or the ties of kinship. In the quiet corners of that world, a marriage could be both entirely real and entirely symbolic. A delicate fiction that preserved an estate, ensured the survival of a family, and left behind a record as dry and unembellished as the tax rolls it outmaneuvered. Perhaps there is a peculiar comfort in knowing that behind the grandeur of history's more famous unions, many such silent arrangements unfolded. They remind us that even in an age of oaths and ritual, the power of a carefully worded clause could be as decisive as any sword. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost feel the cold air of the chapel, hear the faint rustle of parchment, and sense how a simple marriage, never truly lived, could shape the destiny of land and lineage. The scribe who married the manor she worked in. Imagine yourself in the dim, cool hush of a manor house library. Sunlight, filtered through horn-paneled windows, touches the edges of oak shelves lined with parchment rolls and bound ledgers. The air is dense with the comforting scent of vellum and ink, mingling with the faint sweetness of dried lavender tucked between pages to ward off insects. In this quiet sanctuary of records and knowledge worked a woman whose story would become the subject of many hushed conversations. The scribe who married the manor she once only served. She was known first simply as the scribe, a title rare enough for a woman to inspire curiosity in neighboring estates. In a time when literacy was often confined to monasteries and the offices of royal clerks, she had learned her letters early, taught by an uncle who believed no intellect should be left fallow. Her handwriting was admired for its clarity, each letter evenly measured, and her skill with numbers made her indispensable in recording rents, debts, and small exchanges that underpinned the manor's prosperity. Over the years, her careful stewardship of land charters and tenant agreements wove her presence into the fabric of daily life. Imagine the rhythm of her days. At dawn, she would walk the short distance from her modest chamber to the counting room, skirts whispering across the flagstone floor. The steward would bring her tallies of grain, and she would mark the records in ink so dark it seemed almost a shimmer when fresh. Tenants arrived in ones and twos to confirm their holdings or pay rents in coin, wool, or sacks of barley. They would stand quietly while she read their entries aloud, her voice even and patient, her authority unquestioned. When disputes arose, a boundary unclear, a payment contested, it was she who opened the old charters and traced her finger along the lines of ink that held the law of the manor. Over time, the lord of the estate, a man already grayed and slowed by age, came to rely on her counsel more than any other. He would summon her in the evenings to the solar, where she would recite the accounts by candlelight, her words the steady measure of the manor's fortunes. Neighbors noticed how often her advice guided his decisions, how her presence lent the household a quiet stability. Perhaps it was no surprise, though it was certainly unconventional, when he proposed marriage. Imagine the moment when this offer was made, the fire in the hearth crackling softly, a winter wind pressing against the shutters. She would have understood what it meant. Not simply a joining of lives, but an acknowledgement of her indispensable place in this house. To marry the Lord was to cross the invisible boundary that separated servant from kin. It was to step fully into the power she had already exercised in practice. The tenants, accustomed to seeing her as the calm keeper of the records, now greeted her with cautious deference. She was no longer merely the woman who wrote their names in ledgers. She was mistress of the manor itself. Her authority became both official and personal. She continued her work at the long oak desk, but now with the weight of ownership behind her words. When a tenant came to dispute a boundary stone, she could summon the charter, confirm the claim, and pronounce judgment in the same breath. The old lord, her husband, watched this unfolding with a kind of relief. His choice had secured the estate's continuity and entrusted it to hands he trusted more than any heirs. You can imagine how this transformation rippled through the household. Servants adjusted to the new order cautiously, learning to balance familiarity with respect. Younger scribe she had trained took to calling her lady, though she still preferred to be addressed by name when the hall was empty. Even the steward, who had once overseen her work, deferred to her in matters of record and settlement. The ledgers she had kept became instruments not only of management, but of gentle authority. Life continued in its measured cycle. Spring brought the arrival of lambs in the pastures, and she recorded each birth with the same quiet precision she had always practiced. Summer brought disputes over irrigation channels and grazing rights, and she settled them in the small chamber beside the library, her decisions shaping the lives of dozens of families. In autumn, she oversaw the gathering of rents and the careful counting of stores against the coming winter. Each season confirmed that knowledge, more than birthright or custom, had given her power. And yet, she was never a figure of fear. Her reputation was for fairness, for clarity, for a willingness to listen before she judged. Imagine the tenants who came to her in need, the widows uncertain of their claims, the young men eager to prove their rights to a strip of field. She would read aloud the ancient lines of ink, her finger moving slowly across the page, her voice steady and free of condemnation. Even those who left disappointed understood her decisions had been guided by the same measured discipline she had always shown. With the passing years, the manor became as much her creation as any lord's. She commissioned repairs to the chapel roof, expanded the library with texts on agriculture and law, and ensured that every tenant's agreement was properly copied and sealed. By the time her husband's health failed for the last time, few could remember the estate without her presence at its heart. Imagine her in later life, seated by the arched window of the library. The ledger she had once filled still lay on their shelves. The ink of her earliest entries faded to the soft brown of age. She would turn the pages slowly, remembering the long decades of quiet work. The manor outside the window was unchanged in its broad outlines. The same fields, the same hedgerows, but it was transformed by her steady hand. And so the scribe who married the manor became more than a curiosity. She was a reminder that in a world governed by birth and title, knowledge itself could still carve out a place of quiet power. Her story, passed from one generation to the next, whispered that authority need not be inherited, but could be earned, line by line, word by word, in the slow, deliberate work of understanding and recording the truth. The sisters swapped on the wedding day for a better field. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a bustling village, the air filled with a mingled sense of fresh earth and blooming wildflowers, where the steady rhythm of daily life pulses beneath the stone walls of a modest chapel. It is a day meant for celebration, a wedding day. Yet beneath the music and the floral garlands lies a quiet tension shaped by ancient customs and the unyielding demands of land and lineage. Here unfolds a story not of romance, but of strategy, where a lord's choice at the altar would redirect not only the course of two sisters' lives, but also the ownership of fertile fields that sustained an entire community. In medieval society, marriages among the nobility were rarely about personal affection. They were transactions, carefully crafted to secure alliances, strengthen claims, and, above all, consolidate landholdings. Imagine the flickering torchlight in the stone hall, where the lord's advisors debated and calculated the worth of each daughter's dowry, weighing the future prosperity that fertile fields could promise. It was the younger daughter's dowry, lands richer and more productive, that caught the eye and altered the plans drawn for this day. The elder daughter, dressed in fine linens and modest jewels, had prepared to walk the aisle, her heart perhaps filled with a quiet hope for stability in her marriage. Yet, as the wedding procession entered the chapel, the Lord made a calculated decision. At the very threshold where vows were to be exchanged, he presented the younger sister in her stead, her garments carefully arranged to reflect the bride's place, her presence sealing a union dictated by soil rather than sentiment. Imagine the groom, standing before the altar, recognizing this substitution not as a betrayal, but as a matter of course. In the world they inhabited, the exchange was understood without need for protest. The transfer of dowries was a matter of inheritance and strategy, the fertile fields included in the younger daughter's portion promising greater wealth and influence. His acceptance was a silent acknowledgement of the game of power that marriage had become. The ceremony proceeded with the solemnity expected, the clinking of goblets and the murmured prayers weaving through the air. The sisters, bound by blood yet separated by circumstance, each stepped into lives shaped by the Lord's choice. For the elder sister, the day marked a sudden shift from bride to spectator, a change that would ripple through her future prospects and the family's standing. For the younger, it was the beginning of a new role, her dowry a linchpin in the unfolding story of land and lordship. The fertile fields gained through this unexpected swap were more than parcels of earth. They were the foundation of livelihoods, the source of grain that filled granaries, and the measure of a lord's power in a feudal landscape where every acre mattered. Control of such land meant more than wealth. It meant jurisdiction, influence over tenants, and a voice in regional councils where the fates of many were decided. Imagine the villagers who tilled those fields, unaware of the silent exchange that had passed beneath their feet. Their daily labors continued with the changing of seasons, the turning of the plow, the sowing of seeds, the harvesting of grain. Their lives were anchored to the land even as its ownership shifted like a whispered secret between noble houses. This story unfolds a delicate balance between family bonds and feudal necessity. It reveals how women, often regarded as pawns in political games, experience lives redirected by the strategic calculations of male relatives and advisors. The elder sister's sudden displacement and the younger's unexpected elevation illustrate the unpredictable nature of medieval alliances, where personal destinies were inextricably linked to the quest for fertile fields. As you drift through this tale, imagine the quiet aftermath. The sisters' lives unfolding in parallel yet distinct paths, the village fields flourishing under new stewardship, and the Lord's ambitions advanced by a simple but profound act of substitution. The exchange at the altar stands as a testament to the ways in which power, property, and family intertwined, where even the most intimate ceremonies could conceal the subtle shifts of influence that shaped medieval life. So as you settle into the calm, picture the younger sister stepping forward, her gaze steady, her future bound to the land whose fertility had rewritten her destiny. And the elder, watching from the shadows, a silent witness to the trade that traded more than just brides. It traded the very soil beneath their feet. The widow who remarried to keep her vineyard alive. Imagine yourself standing on a hillside just after sunrise. The rows of grapevines stretch in neat green lines across the slope, each leaf catching the pale gold of morning light. If you take a slow breath, you might detect the faint sweetness of ripening fruit mingling with the sharper scent of earth and dew. In medieval Europe, a vineyard was more than a field. It was a symbol of stability and quiet prosperity, an inheritance that could sustain generations. This is the story of a widow who refused to watch that inheritance slip away. Her first marriage had been a conventional match between neighboring families, negotiated more for the alignment of property than for affection. Together, she and her husband tended the vines, supervised the pressing of grapes into must, and arranged the sale of casks to merchants who traveled from the cities. Their vineyard was modest but thriving, each harvest proof that careful stewardship could turn a patch of soil into a source of enduring wealth. When her husband died without warning, the world she had known contracted into uncertainty. The laws of that time were shaped by a combination of custom, ecclesiastical rules, and royal decrees. In many regions, a woman's legal rights to land were only secure as long as she remained married or under the protection of a male guardian. A widow could claim a portion of her husband's estate, her dower, but the vineyard itself, technically part of his family's holdings, might be reassigned to another male relative. Imagine the quiet tension that must have settled over her household. She rose each morning to oversee the workers in the fields, to record the tally of casks in the storage house, and to ensure that the vines were pruned just so. Yet all the while, she knew that her authority could dissolve if a distant cousin appeared with a sealed writ asserting his claim. It was in this atmosphere of precarious control that she made her decision. She would marry again, not out of desire or companionship, but because the marriage contract would reaffirm her standing as the vineyard's mistress. The man she chose was a local laborer, a tenant farmer of limited means and no education. To many, he might have seemed an unlikely candidate. He could not read the ledgers she kept or navigate the intricate agreements that governed sales and taxation. But in the eyes of the law, he was sufficient, a husband whose name, when attached to hers, would anchor her rights to the land. The wedding was a simple affair. No musicians played, no grand feast followed the ceremony. Instead, a priest pronounced the necessary blessings in the village church, while a handful of witnesses stood by in respectful silence. The groom, by all accounts, was a quiet man who understood that he was stepping into a household with its own rhythms and expectations. Imagine how the vineyard must have looked to him the morning after the wedding. The same rows of vines, the same workers who now addressed him formally as master, though he knew, just as they did, that the true steward was his new wife. He signed documents only when she guided his hand to the place where his mark should be made. He listened as she explained the timing of the harvest, the importance of rotating laborers to avoid overworking the soil, and the intricacies of the contracts with the local wine merchants. It would be tempting to cast this arrangement in simple terms: a marriage of convenience, a transaction wrapped in the semblance of matrimony. But over time, those who lived nearby observed that something steadier grew between them. A mutual respect took root, nourished by the shared aim of keeping the vineyard not just solvent but thriving. Though he never learned to read, her new husband grew skilled at the physical work, inspecting trellises for damage, overseeing the pressing, and ensuring that the casks were sealed tightly before shipment. Imagine the harvest seasons that followed. The vineyard would be alive with motion. Workers bending to gather bunches of grapes, children carrying baskets to the press, the air thick with the scent of fermenting juice. In the evenings, she would sit at a rough-hewn table with her accounts spread before her, the flicker of the oil lamp casting long shadows across the parchment. He would sit nearby, mending tools or simply resting, content to leave the reckoning of sums to her capable hand. Their arrangement was no secret. Neighbors understood that it was her knowledge and discipline that guided the vineyard's prosperity. But in a time when legal recognition required a man's name, his presence was the shield that allowed her to keep working without interruption. There were challenges, of course. Bad weather and disease could ruin a harvest overnight. Distant relatives sometimes tried to reopen the question of ownership, sending letters sealed with red wax and heavy with implication. But each time, she met these threats with the same calm certainty. Her marriage contract, signed and witnessed, was unassailable. Her husband's willingness to lend his name and signature without question gave her the freedom to act with the same authority she had wielded before widowhood. In later years, people would say the vineyard owed its survival to her determination. Others claimed that the quiet partnership she forged was a kind of union seldom acknowledged. A marriage built not on romance, but on the shared labor of protecting something that mattered. Imagine standing among those vines centuries later, feeling the same breeze that once carried the scent of crushed grapes and warmed the earth. You might look up the slope and understand, in some quiet way, that this patch of land was preserved by a woman who refused to yield to custom, and by a man willing to stand beside her without needing to lead. The vineyard remained prosperous long after both were gone. Records show it passed to her children, then to her grandchildren, each generation harvesting the same soil. And somewhere in the archives, if you look closely, you will find a marriage record so unremarkable in its wording that it would be easy to overlook. Yet behind that simple document lies a story of resilience, foresight, and the quiet power of a woman who understood that to protect what she loved, she needed only a signature, and her own unshakable resolve. The marriage signed in soil, not ink. Imagine yourself standing in a golden wheat field, the tall stalks swaying gently in a warm breeze beneath a vast, open sky. The earth beneath your feet is rich and dark, filled with the quiet promise of growth and harvest. This field is more than just fertile land. It is the shared foundation of two noble families bound by a pact unlike any other. Instead of sealed parchments locked away in grand chambers, their agreement lay buried beneath this very soil, where ink met earth in a silent testament to alliance and claim. In medieval times, land was the ultimate currency of power, wealth, and survival. Disputes over territory could spark conflict lasting generations, and families sought creative ways to secure their rights. Imagine the tension and negotiation that surrounded such claims, the delicate balance between assertion and diplomacy, where a single document could shape futures. Yet, in this case, rather than rely on written words displayed openly or kept in archives, two families chose a more subtle, almost sacred method to seal their bond. They inscribed their marriage pact, a contract detailing the union and the land to be shared, on parchment, and instead of signing it with seals or witnesses alone, they buried it beneath the corner of a wheat field that both would cultivate and claim. Imagine the solemn ceremony that might have accompanied this act. Hands pressing the document into the soil, a silent promise whispered among those gathered, and the field itself becoming both witness and guardian of their agreement. This burial in soil was both symbolic and practical. By hiding the pact within the earth they would jointly tend, the families intertwined their futures with the cycles of nature, the growth, the harvest, and the enduring fertility of the land. Imagine how each season's sowing and reaping echoed the living contract beneath, the document's presence hidden yet potent, rooting the alliance deep within the very ground. Generations passed, and the written pact remained undisturbed, its existence forgotten even as the family's fortunes rose and fell. Imagine the layers of history accumulating above it, plows turning the soil, crops flourishing, children playing in the fields, while the buried contract lay silently beneath, waiting. Only many years later did chance or circumstance uncover this hidden testament. A discovery that would shed light on old claims and long-forgotten alliances. The rediscovery of such a document carried profound significance. It provided tangible proof of agreements that had shaped land ownership and family relationships for centuries. Imagine the reverence with which the parchment was handled, the careful unrolling revealing ink faded by time but still legible, words bridging past and present, connecting descendants to their heritage, and the complex web of medieval land politics. This story reveals much about the interplay of tradition, trust, and the natural world in medieval society. The choice to bury a marriage pact in soil rather than keep it in ink alone speaks to a worldview where land was living, sacred, and central to identity. Imagine the quiet power of this act. A contract not only signed but planted. A marriage made as much with earth as with words. As you let your thoughts wander through the waving wheat, consider how the cycles of nature mirror the cycles of human relationships. Growth, change, decay, and renewal. The buried pact is a reminder that history often lies hidden beneath the surface, waiting patiently to be uncovered. Its stories rooted in both soil and memory. So, imagine yourself once more in that wheat field, feeling the soil's warmth and strength beneath your feet. Beneath that ground lies a secret pact, a marriage signed in silence and earth, its legacy sown deep within the land. An enduring testament to the bonds that shape not only families, but the very contours of history itself. The secret clause that let a bride reclaim her father's land. Imagine yourself standing in a dim hall lined with carved oak panels, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of passing hands. At the far end, beneath an arched window where pale light filters through imperfect glass, a scribe is bending over a long sheet of vellum. His quill moves slowly, scratching out words so precise they seem almost harmless. Names, dowries, oaths of loyalty. Yet tucked among these carefully drafted phrases lies a single clause, so quietly phrased that even those who signed the document might have overlooked it. In this story, that hidden line would one day change everything. The bride was the only child of a proud but embattled nobleman whose estate had, over the years, slipped into debt. His fields, once fertile, had become a patchwork of poorly tended plots leased to tenants who could barely pay rent. Much of the family's dwindling wealth had been pledged as security for loans, and the prospect of losing the ancestral land weighed heavily on him. A marriage alliance offered a chance to secure some measure of stability. If his daughter married into a family of greater means, perhaps her future, and what remained of his legacy, might be preserved. Her intended husband was a man of middle years, respected and prosperous. His holdings included 3 villages and a manor built in a sheltered valley where the winds rarely grew harsh. Though not a union founded in affection, the match was acceptable to all, and so negotiations began. It was during these discussions that the bride's father, perhaps guided by his steward's advice, insisted upon a provision buried in the contract. This line specified that, should the husband predecease the bride without producing a living heir, the entire estate of her father, including lands already pledged as collateral, would return to her sole control. Most importantly, it provided that these properties could not be challenged by the husband's relatives. To anyone reading quickly, the clause seemed merely a formality, a routine safeguard for a wife's rights. But its true purpose was far more deliberate. It was a last chance to reclaim the family estate in full. Imagine the hush in the hall as the final signatures were set to the parchment. The scribe sprinkled sand to dry the ink, then folded the document with reverence. The moment felt complete, sealed by custom and witnessed by men who did not suspect how consequential that hidden line would become. The wedding itself was modest, a reflection of the times rather than the station of the couple. There were no towering confections or feasts lasting for days. Instead, guests were treated to a single evening of solemn toasts, a simple meal of roast fowl and stewed apples, and the quiet murmurs of those who had come mostly out of obligation. The bride, draped in a gown of heavy wool dyed a deep green, accepted her place beside her new husband with the composure expected of her. Though she scarcely knew the man, she understood that the alliance was her father's last hope of rescuing their name. For 6 weeks, daily life unfolded in the subdued rhythm of a household newly joined. She rose before dawn to hear Mass in the chapel adjoining the manor. She spent her afternoons learning the names of tenants and the particulars of the land she would now help administer. And if she thought often of her father's estate, the field she had run across as a child, the orchard where she once gathered early plums, she gave no sign. Then, as winter began its slow advance, her husband fell ill. Some accounts describe it as a sudden fever. Others hint at a longer decline, hidden by a proud man unwilling to acknowledge frailty. In any case, his condition worsened rapidly. Within days, he was confined to bed. Despite the ministrations of physicians and the prayers of household clergy, he slipped away one cold morning, the air in his chamber sharp with the scent of vinegar and damp linen. It was then that the quiet power of the contract revealed itself. While the household reeled in mourning, the bride sent word to her father's steward. The marriage contract was retrieved from a locked coffer. In the hush of the manor's chapel, the document was read aloud, line by line, before the assembled witnesses. When the hidden clause was spoken, many present were startled. The words were simple but impossible to contest. By law, every parcel of land, every orchard and pasture her father had pledged away, was now her property alone. Imagine the confusion that followed. The late husband's family, unprepared for such a turn, dispatched envoys to petition the regional magistrate. But the clause was clear. No testimony of intent, no claim of misunderstanding could dissolve it. Within days, scribes had prepared the new charters of ownership, and messengers rode out to inform tenants that their rents were due to her coffers. What had once been her father's land, fragmented by debt and legal entanglement, was restored to her governance with the force of law behind it. The months that followed were marked by a quiet determination. She did not remarry, perhaps unwilling to risk placing the estate again in another's hands. Instead, she took up the role of mistress in earnest. She traveled to each holding, reviewing accounts, hearing petitions, and overseeing the repairs that her father had never been able to afford. Over time, the land recovered. Orchards were pruned, fields reseeded, mills repaired. The tenants, uncertain at first, came to respect her unflinching stewardship. If you picture her standing at the threshold of her manor, the cold wind tugging at her dark cloak, you might sense the gravity that comes when a life is shaped by both duty and an unspoken resolve. She had not planned to reclaim her inheritance through widowhood, but neither did she flinch from the role that fate, and one carefully placed line of ink, had assigned her. In the end, her story became a quiet legend among the local families. Some called her cunning, others merely fortunate. But in the records preserved in the archives, the same archives where the marriage contract still rests, she is remembered simply as the woman who reclaimed her father's land. A reminder that, in an age ruled by parchment and seal, a hidden clause could transform not only property but destiny itself.